Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We will describe the temporal and infratemporal fossa. The temporal fossa is the space on the side of the skull below the temporal lines. Here is the temporal lines, superior and inferior temporal lines, and above the zygomatic arch. While the infratemporal fossa is a space deep to the ramus of the mandible, both the temporal fossa and infratemporal fossa communicate with each other through the space deep to the zygomatic arch. This is the temporal fossa, bounded by the superior and inferior temporal lines, and the zygomatic arch below, present on the side of the skull. This is the infratemporal fossa, deep to the ramus of the mandible. Both the temporal and the infratemporal fossa communicate with each other through the space deep to the zygomatic arch. The contents of the temporal fossa are the temporalis muscle and its nerve supply to temporal nerves, and the two temporal vessels. The temporal fossa contains the temporalis muscle. This is the temporalis muscle, and if we remove the temporalis muscle, we will find the deep temporal arteries. These are the temporal arteries. This is the zygomatic arch is cut. This zygomatic arch completed here. This is the one end. Here the zygomatic arch is cut. This is the ramus of the mandible. This is the temporalis muscle cut to show the contents of the temporal fossa. The temporal fossa contains the temporalis muscle and two temporal arteries running with them two temporal nerves. Yes, this is the infratemporal fossa. As we said before, it lies deep to the ramus of the mandible. To visualize, to see the contents of the infratemporal fossa, the ramus of the mandible is cut to see its contents, and also the zygomatic arch is cut to show the space communicating it with the temporal fossa. These are the temporal nerves. These are the temporal nerves, and these are the temporal arteries, as well as the temporalis muscle, which are the contents of the temporal fossa. Returning back to the infratemporal fossa, it is the space which lies deep to the ramus of the mandible. So the ramus of the mandible here is cut to see its contents. What are the contents of the infratemporal fossa? It contains muscles of mastication, which are the temporalis. It contains the tendon of the temporalis and pterygoid muscles, The masseter muscle, in my opinion, it is not one of the contents of the infratemporal fossa. It takes origin from the zygomatic arch and inserted into the outer surface of the ramus of the mandible, so it covers the infratemporal fossa from outside. So the infratemporal fossa containing muscles of mastication, we must enumerate these muscles: temporalis, masseter, here it is not present. Pterygoid muscle, this is the medial pterygoid muscle. This is the medial pterygoid muscle, and the lateral pterygoid removed from here. Maxillary artery, mandibular nerve and its branches, mandibular nerve, chorda tympani nerve, this is the yellow line, this is the chorda tympani nerve. This is the mandibular nerve and its branches. So the mandibular fossa, the infratemporal fossa, contains muscles of mastication, which are four muscles: mandibular nerve, maxillary artery and its vein, pterygoid venous plexus. Pterygoid venous plexus, we will see it later on, and otic ganglion suspended from the mandibular nerve. The maxillary nerve, if it is present in the infratemporal fossa, a very small part, here is the maxillary nerve. This is the trigopalatine fossa. Sometimes it returning back to the anterior part of the infratemporal fossa, then enter the inferior orbital fissure to complete its course. Here is another figure to show the contents of the infratemporal fossa. This is the lateral pterygoid muscle. This is the lateral pterygoid muscle. Here is the buccal nerve, branch from the anterior division of mandibular. This is the inferior alveolar. This is the inferior alveolar. This is the lingual nerve. This figure to show other contents of the infratemporal fossa. Then, what about the muscles of mastication? Muscles of mastication are four muscles. First, the temporalis, masseter, and medial and lateral pterygoid muscles. The temporalis takes origin from the floor of the temporal fossa. This is the floor of the temporal fossa, and superior and the inferior temporal lines. These are two lines overlying each other, superior and the inferior. Yes, and from the deep surface of the temporal fascia, which covers the temporal fossa, its tendon passes deep to the zygomatic arch. This is the zygomatic arch, to be inserted into the coronoid process of the mandible. This is the coronoid process of the mandible, the temporalis tendon passes deep to the zygomatic arch, takes insertion into the upper border, the tip of the coronoid process, its posterior border, and its anterior border. Then it takes in the anterior border, tip, posterior border, and the medial surface of coronoid process of the mandible. The nerve supply of the temporalis muscle is from the anterior division of mandibular nerve by 2 or 3 temporal branches, which we see them before, which these are the 3 temporal branches from the anterior division of mandibular nerve, passing deep to the zygomatic arch to supply the temporalis muscle. Returning back, this is the temporalis. We see its nerve supply by 2 or 3 branches from the anterior division of mandibular nerve. Its action is to elevate the mandible. Elevate the mandible equals to elevate the temporomandibular joint, equal to close the mouth. They have the same meaning. And its posterior fiber, these are the posterior fiber inserted here into the coronoid process of the mandible, retract the mandible. Actually, this fiber retract the protracted mandible. Yes, this is the vaccinator muscle, one as a muscle of the face, not belonging to the muscles of mastication. This is the insertion of the temporalis muscle. It is inserted into the tip of the coronoid process of the mandible, its anterior border, and its posterior border and medial surface. Here is the masseter muscle. This is the masseter muscle. It takes origin from the lower border and inner surface of the zygomatic arch. This is the zygomatic arch. It is inserted into the outer surface of the ramus of the mandible near its angle. Here is the insertion of the masseter muscle, outer surface of ramus of mandible near its angle. This is the insertion of masseter. This is the insertion of temporalis. This is the masseter muscle. It takes origin from the lower border and the inner surface of the zygomatic arch. It is inserted into the outer surface of ramus of mandible near its angle. Its action is to elevate the mandible or elevate the temporomandibular joint, the same meaning, or closes the mouth. All these 3 sentences have the same meaning. It also protracts the mandible. The nerve supply of the masseter muscle is by a branch from the anterior division of mandibular nerve. Here is the pterygoid muscles, lateral pterygoid and medial pterygoid. The lateral pterygoid and the medial pterygoid. Each of them has two heads. The lateral pterygoid has upper head and lower head. Lateral pterygoid has a lower head, LL, and upper head, while the medial pterygoid has a superficial head and medial head. They are called lateral and medial pterygoid. However, to distinguish them on a cadaver, the lateral pterygoid lies at an upper plane than the medial pterygoid. This feature can distinguish these muscles from each other perfectly than medial and lateral. At the same time, the medial pterygoid part from the medial pterygoid, this part is the superficial head, is more lateral to lateral pterygoid. This is a misname. Lateral and medial pterygoid misname, but it is preferably called upper pterygoid and lower pterygoid. But these nomenclatures are agreed on them among all anatomists. This is the lateral pterygoid muscle. It has an upper head and lower head, lateral, lower, LL. This is the medial pterygoid, have a deep head and superficial head. This is the lateral pterygoid blade. This is the lateral pterygoid blade, which shares in the origin of both muscles. The lateral pterygoid upper head takes origin from the infratemporal surface and the infratemporal crest of the greater wing of the sphenoid. This is the greater wing of the sphenoid. The suture separates it from the squamous part of temporal bone. The lower head of lateral pterygoid takes origin from the lateral surface of lateral pterygoid blade. It is inserted into the pterygoid fovea, which is present in front of the neck of the mandible, as well as into the articular disc and the capsule of temporomandibular joint. Okay, this is the insertion. The origin of lateral pterygoid by upper head from the infratemporal surface and the infratemporal crest of this bone, which is the greater wing of sphenoid. The lower head from the lateral surface of lateral pterygoid blade. Lower head of lateral pterygoid 2L from lateral surface 3L of lateral pterygoid blade 4L. Insertion in front of the neck of the mandible into what is called the pterygoid fovea. Some fiber extend to be inserted into the capsule and the intra-articular disc of the temporomandibular joint. The medial pterygoid have two heads, the superficial head and the deep head. The superficial head of medial pterygoid takes origin from the maxillary tuberosity. The deep head takes origin from the medial surfaces of lateral pterygoid blade. It is inserted into the inner surface of ramus of the mandible. This is the ramus of mandible corresponding to the insertion of masseter. The masseter from outside and the medial pterygoid from inside. This is another picture for the pterygoid muscles. This is another picture for pterygoid. This is the medial pterygoid muscle. This is the medial pterygoid muscle. This is the medial pterygoid muscle on both sides. This is the lateral pterygoid muscle. It is inserted into the pterygoid fovea in front of the neck of the mandible, while the medial pterygoid muscle is inserted into the inner surface of ramus of the mandible. The nerve supply of lateral pterygoid is by a branch from the lateral pterygoid from the anterior division of mandibular nerve. However, the medial pterygoid is the only muscle which takes nerve supply from the trunk of mandibular nerve. It takes a branch. The medial pterygoid muscle is supplied by a branch from the trunk of mandibular nerve. Okay. Another picture. This is the medial pterygoid muscle. This is the lateral pterygoid plate. The medial pterygoid muscle have a superficial head-taking origin from the maxillary tuberosity, and the deep head takes origin from the medial surface of lateral pterygoid plate. This is the lateral pterygoid plate. It is inserted into the inner surface of ramus of the mandible near its angle, corresponding to the insertion of masseter from outside. This is the lateral pterygoid muscle. The lateral pterygoid muscle, as we said before, takes origin from by two heads, upper head and lower head. The lower head takes origin from the lateral surface. Here is the lateral surface of lateral pterygoid plate. Lateral surface of lateral pterygoid plate. The upper head takes origin from the greater wing of sphenoid. Its infratemporal crest. Both heads are inserted into the pterygoid fovea, which is present in front of the neck of the mandible. The medial pterygoid takes a nerve supply by a branch from the trunk of mandibular nerve, while the lateral pterygoid takes nerve supply by a branch from its anterior division. In this figure, we want to see the lateral pterygoid plate. This is the lateral pterygoid plate, which gives origin to the medial pterygoid deep head and the lateral pterygoid lower head. This is the lateral pterygoid plate. Also, in this picture, this is the pterygoid process as a whole. This is the lateral pterygoid plate. This is the lateral pterygoid plate, which in its medial surface gives origin to the deep head of medial pterygoid muscle, and on its lateral surface gives origin to the lower head of lateral pterygoid muscle. What about the action of both lateral and medial pterygoid muscle? The action of these two muscles. The medial pterygoid elevates the mandible, while the lateral pterygoid muscle in its contraction pulls the neck of the mandible forward, so it depresses the mandible. It opens the mouth. The lateral pterygoid muscle is the only muscles of mastication which depress the mandible or depress the temporomandibular joint or open the mouth. It is very important. The muscle of mastication are four muscles: temporalis, masseter, medial pterygoid, and lateral pterygoid. All of them elevate the mandible except the lateral pterygoid, the only muscle of mastication which depresses the mandible. Of course, the mandible have other muscles and other factors, not muscles which depress it, but the muscle of mastication which depresses the mandible is the only lateral pterygoid muscle. Yes, both of two medial and lateral pterygoid protrude the mandible and produce side-to-side movement of the mandible, which is called showing movement during eating. This is the insertion of medial pterygoid muscle into the inner surface of the ramus of the mandible. This is the inner surface of the mandible. This is the ramus. This is the insertion of medial pterygoid muscle corresponding to its insertion from the outside is the insertion of masseter muscle. This is the insertion of temporalis muscle into the tip of coronoid process of mandible, its anterior border. Sometimes the insertion of temporalis muscle extends into the anterior border till the last molar tooth. This is very important on dentistry during teenagers procedure. This is the insertion of lateral pterygoid muscle. Here we will describe the temporomandibular joint in association with the muscles of mastication, as these muscles act on the temporomandibular joint. This joint is synovial joint of condylar variety. The articular surface is the head of the mandible, with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, the head of the mandible below, with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone above. But it is very important to know that this joint has an intra-articular disc. This intra-articular disc divides the joint cavity into two cavities. So it is considered as two joints, not one joint. Okay. This is the intra-articular disc, as this is the head of the mandible forming the lower articular surface. This is the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone forming the upper articular surface. This is the intra-articular disc of the temporomandibular joint, which divides the joint cavity into two cavities. Okay, if we see in this diagram, this is the intra-articular disc. This is the head of the mandible. This is the mandibular fossa. Then what are the articular surfaces of the temporomandibular joint? First, head of mandible below. Second, the mandibular fossa above. Third, intra-articular disc. It must be mentioned with the articular surfaces as it shares in the movement of the joint and control its movement. Okay, this is the capsule. This is the capsule of temporomandibular joint. Okay, this is the capsule of the temporomandibular joint. This is the capsule of temporomandibular joint. What are the ligaments? This is the sphenomandibular ligament. This is the sphenomandibular ligament. Okay. Oh, and the temporomandibular. This is the stylomandibular ligament and the temporomandibular ligament. This is the sphenomandibular ligament. It is stretched between the spine of the sphenoid and the lingula of the mandible. It has a very important relation. The maxillary artery passes forwards between the neck of the mandible and this ligament, sphenomandibular ligament. This is the maxillary artery. The inferior alveolar nerve and the vessels pass deep to this ligament. The sphenomandibular ligament. And this is the auriculotemporal nerve which ascend between the neck of the mandible and the sphenomandibular ligament to enter the parotid gland. This is the trigomandibular raphe. Trigomandibular raphe, which was considered as one of the ligaments of the temporomandibular joint. This is the trigomandibular raphe. It can be felt if one introduces his finger on his mouth between the last molar tooth, last molar upper and lower tooth. It is a band of mucous membrane between the last molar tooth. Everyone can felt it by introducing his finger on his mouth away between the posterior end of the upper jaw and the lower jaw. It is a fibrous mucous band or band of mucous membrane which separates two important muscles. This is the buccinator muscle and this is the superior constrictor muscle of the phalanx. Now, what are the movements of the temporomandibular joint? As we stated before, this joint we have to mention its movement in association with the muscles of mastication, as the muscles of mastication act mainly on the temporomandibular joint. Its movement is considered as a revision for the muscles of mastication. This is the temporomandibular joint. This is the capsule. This is the capsule lined from inside by the synovial membrane. Lined from inside by the synovial membrane. And we state its ligament called the ligament of the temporomandibular joint. Ligaments of the temporomandibular joint again. This is the articular surfaces, head of mandible, mandibular fossa of temporal bone, intra-articular disc. These are the articular surfaces. After the articular surfaces, we see the capsule and the ligaments. This is the ligament. This ligament from the sphenomandibular ligament. Okay, and outside is the lateral temporomandibular ligament. The capsule is lined by the synovial membrane. This is the stylomandibular ligament, and we see the trigomandibular raphe. This is the sphenomandibular ligament, and we state its relations. It has a very important relations. The maxillary artery passes forwards between the neck of the mandible and the sphenomandibular ligament. The auriculotemporal nerve branch from the posterior mandibular passes backwards between the neck of mandible and the sphenomandibular ligament. The inferior alveolar nerve and the nerve to mylohyoid and inferior alveolar vessels pass deep to this ligament. What about the movement of the temporomandibular joint? The temporomandibular joint, as we this is the temporomandibular joint. The mandible can be depressed, but depression of the mandible to open the mouth, the only muscle of mastication which depresses the mandible is the lateral pterygoid muscle. However, the mandible can be depressed by other factors. Suprahyoid muscles which attach to the mandible from below as posterior belly of the gastric, and the mylohyoid muscle can depress the mandible. Then these are the muscular factors. The mandible can also be depressed passively by during sleep. If one sleeps as he is sitting down, as a student at a lecture, at a boring lecture, he sleep. His mandible falls by its weight. This leads to obstruction of the oropharynx. The individual or the student can snore. Yes, depress mandible depression elevation. All muscles of mastication, temporalis, medial pterygoid, masseter can elevate the mandible except the lateral pterygoid. Protrusion, masseter, protrudal mandible, and lateral medial pterygoid, protrudal mandible. Retraction, a temporalis muscle only by its posterior fibers, side-to-side movement of the mandible, but done by the temporalis, posterior fibers of temporalis muscle. In this lecture, we describe in this lecture the temporal fossa and the infratemporal fossa and the state their contents. Yes, don't forget, these two fossa are communicate with each other by through the space deep to the zygomatic arch. Then the contents of the temporal fossa are the temporalis muscle, deep temporal arteries and nerves. The contents of the infratemporal fossa are muscles of mastication, maxillary artery, mandibular nerve, chorda tympani, and mandibular nerve, maxillary artery, and the vein, and the pterygoid venous plexus, and the correlated structures, and the mandibular nerve and its correlated structures, which are the otic ganglion and the chorda tympani nerve. Then we state or describe the muscles of mastication. Temporalis, and state its insertion. Masseter, insertion at medial and lateral pterygoid muscles, as well as the temporomandibular joint. Thank you.